Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The CLC lecture is about to begin. I'd like to remind you to turn your mobile phones to silent mode if you haven't already done so. Can I also please request you to move up front because there are a few seats up here that are unoccupied? Thank you. Distinguished guests and fellow colleagues, welcome to today's CLC lecture series. My name is Nisha and I'm from the Center for Livable Cities. The center was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of the Environment, Water and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC lecture series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. In today's session, we are honored to have with us Dr. Ishar Ahluwalia, Chairperson and Board of Governors at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, in short, ICREA. This lecture will showcase some innovations and best practices from several Indian cities seen through Dr. Ishar's 4 years of travel. At the end of the lecture, Dr. Ishar will launch her latest book, which details the processes and people involved in these success stories. The format for today's lecture will start off with a talk by Dr. Ishar. This will be followed by a closed panel discussion and a Q&A session with the audience, which will be moderated by Dr. Amitendu Palit, Head, Partnerships and Programs, and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies in the National University of Singapore. And with that, let us begin by inviting Dr. Ishar on stage. Dr. Ishar, please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking the Center for Livable Cities, in particular, Mr. Khoo Teng Chai, the Executive Director of the Center, for giving me the opportunity to come on a fellowship to Singapore, which really is the Mecca of learning on urban development. I am exactly at the midpoint of my visit today, and I'm really very happy to have this opportunity to speak and engage with you. I must begin by making a full disclosure that I am not an urban economist or an urban planner or a city manager. I am a mainstream economist who has spent much of my career chasing exchange rates and interest rates, but I was lured into urban development by being invited by the Government of India to head a committee on urban infrastructure and services. And this was in March of 2008, and I think this is the best thing that could ever happen to me, because in the process of working on the report for this committee, which was supposed to give an estimate of how much investment is required to bridge the infrastructure deficit in urban areas in India, and what we could do to improve service delivery, we found that you can't really talk about investment without talking about financing. And when you get to financing, it is so intimately linked up with governance and with the federal structure which lays down the finances for the urban local governments, that while much of economics came into it, there were a whole lot of new areas that were opened up on why it was that we did not have continuous supply of water, drinking water for our citizens in our urban areas. What were we doing with wastewater treatment? How do we manage our solid waste? And in the process, as I got more and more involved, I started a monthly column which came out. This has been going on now for 4 years, even after I submitted the committee's report. This monthly column looked at some of the best practices in Indian cities and how they were able to transform a particular particular area of urban development. I'm afraid I cannot really give you a model city in India because I don't think any of our cities has really done all that is needed to be called really a good livable city. But in some areas, in some cities, a remarkable transformation has been achieved over a very short period. So I felt that it was important to document these stories and provide an overall context because we need to see how we can upscale these achievements, how we can adapt and replicate them to other cities. And it is not just that you have to be a city in Singapore, you have to be a Singapore, or you have to be a city in Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe to break these barriers of governance. In fact, there are places within India where you were able to do it, and now let us get on with the job of learning from each other and also learning from other cities and states that have really attained urban transformation. So I thought it was important for me to say where I'm coming from. One book which is being launched here and where we will discuss, Dr. Palit and me, and with you later on, is the one that documents the case studies. There is another book that I have co-edited with Professor Ravi Kanbur and Dr. Mohanty, and in that we have tried to present a more conceptual, analytical way of looking at the Indian urbanization challenge and where it's heading and how we need to fix it at a macro level. So from this perspective, you can see that the timing of my visit here could not have been better because the books were just released last month in different parts of India, and I have had some very, very valuable briefings, discussions, reading material that I have been able to spend some time reading and visits in Singapore. And I'm going to use this opportunity to first give you a general overview on urbanization and economic growth in India, and then talk about some of these case studies. Now, India's level of urbanization at 31% is much lower than most countries we like to compare ourselves with. So whether it is China with 48% or Korea with 83% of its population being urban, or Mexico 78%, or Brazil 87%, we have a long way to go when it comes to urbanization. However, the absolute level of the urban challenge is very large because even at 31%, we have 377 million people living in Indian cities and towns, and this is projected to increase to 600 million by 2031. We have 53 cities today with population of more than 1 million, and this is projected to increase to 87 by 2031. The rural-urban migration has contributed about 20% or so to the increase in urban population over the over the period, let's say, from 1981 to 2001. This is the data that we have available. For the latest decade, 2001 to 2011, we don't have information, but all indications are that this 20% must have increased to something like 24 or 25%, because this was the decade when economic growth really accelerated big time. There is another phenomenon that I would like to share with you, and that is that when the census brings out the numbers, they show some cities as being ready to be called urban. However, the state government has to actually notify that these are now urban local governments and no longer rural local governments. But that process somehow does not take place because there is a reluctance to recognize urbanization. As a result, what happens is that you have many areas as cities expand, many peri-urban areas, which are crying for urban infrastructure, but they don't have a statutory government authority which can convey their needs to the, which can really act as representative and deliver what is needed for urban infrastructure. You will see why I mention this later on as I go down. Now, a little brief on growth. As you perhaps know that in 1991, India had a major break in its economic policy regime when India decided to move from being a closed economy, an economy closed to foreign trade and foreign investment, to one which gradually began to open up. And over a 10-year period from 1991 to 2001, we had a consistent opening up of the economy, both in terms of domestic deregulation, more liberal trade policies, policies to encourage foreign investment and all that. And as this happened, a credibility was established with the private sector that these policies are there to stay. It took 10 years for the government of India to establish that credibility, that this turnaround was not just a blip, but that India had chosen to integrate with the world economy. And beginning 2001, if you look at the decade from 2001 to 2011, you had a massive increase in private investment. So you had acceleration in growth from 5.5% in the previous decade to almost 8% in the decade from 2001 to 2011. You had, in the same period, this growth was led by the private sector. It was led by the services sector. So cities were really acting as engines of growth. However, this growth was not really associated with a sharp increase in employment. This was a major failing of the Indian growth process. And even when there was increase in employment, it was mostly in the informal sectors. So the challenges that appeared were, one, infrastructure deficit, two, skill deficit, and third, governance deficit. As you suddenly saw an increase in the growth rate, which continued for 10 years, the institutions of governance, and I mean by those regulatory institutions, judicial institutions, or administrative capacity of the state to adapt its institutions for a much faster growth rate and a much larger role of market forces, that did not happen. And among these, one of the major problems, which I'm going to be talking about, was that there was no planning for urbanization. It was as if with this acceleration in growth, urbanization happened, but urban infrastructure was not ready. This was very different from the experience of China, where they actually hold back movement to urban areas until the infrastructure is in place. So the result was urban sprawl, coming up of slums, poor state of service delivery. Now, state governments are the principal governments which are responsible for the delivery of urban services. However, with a constitutional amendment in 1992, this role has now been assigned to the local governments. While the local governments are now made accountable, city governments are accountable for service delivery, this mandate of the Constitution is unfunded because the state governments have not made room for the city governments by giving them funding in terms of guaranteed, predictable transfers from higher levels of government. Neither can the city governments raise resources through taxation, nor do they get automatic guaranteed transfers from the higher levels. So they are really dependent on the whims of the state government for their finances. But finances have been a major problem. However, capacity to plan and manage at the city level is another problem which has come in the way. The in the light of that, one major development that happened in India in 2005 was that the government of India decided it was time for this government to nudge the state governments and the city governments, which now had responsibility for service delivery, to do the reforms in finance and governance and in planning and management in order to improve the state of Indian cities. And for that, there was a mission that was set up. It was called Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, in which the central government put across the funds. They would say put 70% and 30% will come from state or local government. With more advanced states, they will put up 50% and the remaining will come. But along with the funds, both the state government and the local government had to agree to certain reforms. Therefore, this was meant to nudge the state governments and the third-tier government to do the reforms necessary, get the funding, come up with a city development plan, within that identify a particular project, and then get that funded from the Government of India. Now, this funding was like oxygen to city governments who had never seen any money before. But at the same time, they did not, most of them did not have the capacity to plan and manage. So what happened was that city development plans were quickly put together, brought to the center, money got, and some infrastructure deficits were bridged. And as with most such missions, what we found was that the state governments which created an enabling environment, the state governments which had devolved funding to their local governments, and which handheld the local governments to plan and manage, were the ones which got the maximum benefit from this mission. And it was at that time that I had decided that I must go down and see some of these projects. Not all JNNURM projects were successful, because many failed because they weren't planned right and there were lots of other problems. But there were some that were functioning. So the idea was to try and document what has worked and why. And I did that for about 7 or 8 projects, and then it was time to submit the report. But what I found was that this ground level knowledge that I was gaining by these tours was so addictive that I could not put an end to this exercise after the report was submitted. So I carried on my search. So every month I would go to some city or some small town, go and visit some of the facilities, talk to local government officials, talk to NGOs, talk to others, to try and see why that project was working. Now, there is a self-selection bias here, because I'm only chasing best practices. And 40 good projects out of 8,000 cities times sectors and projects doesn't really require a big kind of applause. But the idea here is not to give an applause, but to show that when the conditions are right, it is a low-lying fruit. And before I go to some of these, which I will just describe to you, what I found was that new technology was making a big difference in urban transformation, whether it is software packages for redressing grievances of people through e-governance, or GPS, GPRS, which are put in municipal vehicles or buses to save energy, or GIS to plug power theft, or look at hydraulic models to see where you need fixing in the distribution network. Many, many local governments are really now using this technology to do things which even 5 years ago they would not have had access to. A second very important role was that of human leadership. it's amazing in this day and world when we talk about all the other grand ingredients. At the end of the day, when you look through these 40 stories, the one thing that comes across very clearly is the role of a champion. A champion who created stakeholding, created a team, got the partners to work with him or her, and how that makes all the difference. Funding is important, but much more important than funding are these other elements, is the story that comes through. So let me just, how much time do I have? 1-3, very good. So I would just like to share some of these stories with you in order to knock down some of the general cynical approach that we Indians have ourselves. There is a small town called Malkapur in Maharashtra, which is one of our most industrialized states, but this is a small town of 40,000 people in Maharashtra. And they have, when they started thinking about continuous water supply through a piped network, they were not even a Nagar Panchayat. They were not an urban local government. They were at that time a village local government. But there was a very dynamic leader who decided. And how did he decide? He learned that in one of the nearby towns called Badlapur, Malaysians had given some technical assistance and they were trying to develop continuous water supply. So this was a greenfield area and he said, why not? We should try and do that. By the time the project was approved and the state government put in the money, it took about 3 years. By the time the project was ready to be commissioned, this local government had transited from being a village local government to an urban local government. And also, ironically, it was reserved for a woman leader. So, in the elections, only a woman could stand to lead from that particular, it was randomly selected to be such an urban local government. So he could no longer be the mayor of this town, and he was elected as the vice mayor. And there was a woman leader, but he did not give up. He carried on with it. And that town agreed to user charges to cover costs. It took a survey to determine how there will be any element of cross-subsidy. And in the end, today, the story is that that town is giving 24/7 water to all its residents, which not even Delhi, my capital city where I live, does. So when I was at an ADB-sponsored seminar in 2010, and they were presenting to us cases of water transformation. Mr. Aksun Sin, who is the water miracle man of Phnom Penh, he was himself present, and he had told us a story of how he had transformed the Phnom Penh water system, which was, war-ravaged distribution network. And sitting there, I was thinking, we were also given stories of public-private partnership in Metro Manila, in Manila, what had happened. I could see that we in India could probably get public-private partnership, but I was thinking, when will it be that I see a reform of a public utility to do what Phnom Penh has done? Well, Malkapur has done it, So like that, there are also some areas in public-private partnership in water that has progressed slowly because we are still struggling with this whole concept of water being a gift of nature and how there are investments needed to bring that gift from where it is to urban areas, to run it through your pipes in a clean way. I think we will win that struggle, but because there is this, there are vested interests and there's political opposition that comes in the way to raising user charges to cover costs, that progress has been slower, although Nagpur will be a good test case. This is a big city in Maharashtra where public-private partnership is being tried and actually in the context of an integrated water management system. The second case I'll tell you is one of Alandur. It is a small town of about 150,000 people, and it's just outside of Chennai, the old Madras in Tamil Nadu. And this town has middle-class people who spilled over to live here because Chennai was becoming very expensive with the acceleration in growth. But this town had no underground sewerage. And in 2001, a mayor, a directly elected mayor, decided that he was going to see to it that there will be 100% underground sewerage. He got public support and participation so much that he was able to raise, this was a total project cost of 34 crores, which will be 0.34 billion rupees, of which half was coming from the government of India, but the other half had to be raised. And the World Bank had said to him that if you can raise 3 crores from the public, we will give you the remaining sum to bridge your gap. He canvassed so hard that he ended up getting 12 crores from the public. And he then didn't need to go to the World Bank because at that stage the state government stepped in and said, we will support you. And within 4 years, he got the whole town with... The interesting part is that when it was time to commission this project, the state government had an election and there was a new chief minister. Jayalalitha was the chief minister. This mayor was supposed to have been very close to the DMK chief, the earlier chief minister. Everybody in Chennai and around told him that the fate of his project was sealed and that Jayalalitha would never come to commission. He went to the new chief minister, explained what he had done, and got across to her that this was a project of the public, and he would want her to come and own it, and she did. Now, the story, unfortunately, doesn't end there. It was running very well, but lately, about a year ago, Alandur, the small town, has been merged into the Greater Chennai Metropolitan Corporation. So its water is now looked after by a state-level board rather than the local municipality, and some challenges have emerged. I'm sure that they will overcome them, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that they lived happily ever after. Hopefully they will, but not yet. Pune, 5 minutes? Yeah. Pune is another major city of Maharashtra. Actually, it's the second largest city, which has experimented with different models of solid waste management, depending on whether they can get their residents to segregate the waste into dry and wet, and use wet waste to have biomethanation plants, or where they cannot, where they have unsegregated waste, to opt for high technology solutions of gasification plants or plasma plant for... in fact, this is an area in which there is a lot of private sector interest in India because the local governments are really seized of this responsibility of learning how to dispose of waste. But as I learned from my discussions with Mr. Lowe and some others yesterday, that the task really has to begin first by building awareness. You have to reduce waste and then segregate, then recycle, recover, process, and then whatever limited bit you cannot do anything to, you put in the landfill or dispose. So I think we are at a stage where we are recognizing the importance of this. The chief ministers are very interested in doing this, but they are a little bit at a loss on what the options are, which are environment friendly. And there is also a lot of confusion, some of it actually motivated confusion to confuse the policymakers. So we, people like us from think tanks, have a responsibility to clarify the issues, and the lessons that I take back from Singapore would really be very, very valuable in my discourses back at home. Finally, in Hyderabad, which is in Andhra Pradesh, one of our southern states, they have, we have not had much integrated land use and transport planning. The only example, well, not only, maybe one or two others that I could find was in Hyderabad, where when they are building the outer ring road to expand the periphery of the city, they are trying to unlock land value and tap into that unlocked land value to get money to put into infrastructure, because otherwise, to finance these infrastructure projects is not possible. And that model is now being looked at by many, many people. Where we have had new transport initiatives, somehow they have been limited. They have not gone for last mile connectivity, and they have not gone for the transit-oriented mode where your FSI and all of those things are looked at together. So of course there is no substitute for an overall planned framework within which you fit the different holes. But when you have so much diversity across so many states of India, and you have so much backlog that you have to handle, then perhaps in India, we may not be able to do it the Singapore way, but we certainly need to learn from Singapore to develop parcels of our states, at least some cities where we prove what are the main ingredients to get the state of our cities improved. I think in the end, I will end with a confession of the economists, and I think we are to blame, because when we talked of improving investment climate in India, we always talked of reducing the transactions cost of doing business. We were so worried about all the long procedures and processes of government that we said you must reduce that if you want investment. But today, it is very clear that even if you bring the transactions cost of doing business to zero, if you don't fix your cities, you will not get that investment, because this investment has to take place in this planet, in these cities. And I think that lesson, that message has now gone to the chief ministers of state governments. I have had interaction with at least 12 of them, and they are certainly talking the talk. Now, the only question is how to make them to walk the talk. There, my bullish approach comes from the fact that I feel in a democracy, today we are demanding good governance. We have half our population which is below the age of 25, and it's going to be that way until 2040. We are in that sweet spot of demographic transition where the percentage of our working age population to total population is going to be rising until then. Now, if we do not empower this generation, and if we don't skill them, if we don't offer employment opportunities, then this dividend, the so-called demographic dividend, could turn into a disaster. And I think today, Indian politics is just about beginning to understand that. And since we have a vibrant media and a young and aspiring population and communications with the rest of the world, where we see other countries, other cities are doing it, the pressure is going to be on our polity. So I think we have a long way to go, but perhaps we'll make the journey faster because we've been a latecomer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Esher. I'd like to invite Dr. Amit to join Dr. Esher on stage for the panel discussion, followed by the Q&A. During the Q&A session, please raise your hands and our staff will walk over with a mic to you, or there are mics on the side of the room. Please state your name and organization. I'd like to hand the floor over now to Dr. Amit as well as Dr. Isher.
Thank you so much, and as always, it's a delight and a privilege to hear Dr. Ahluwalia, and I'm one of those very rare people, I think the only one in this audience who has had the experience of working with her, and those were actually years that left me wiser, much more learned through the little bit of interactions that I have had with her. And I'm sure today's expose on urban development in India, the challenges that India faces, and the efforts that are going on in India at different levels, often unnoticed, often not captured as appropriately by the media as they should, have probably brought to your notice that how the world's second largest and most populous country is trying to address a lot of these challenges. And maybe on this note, I would probably like to ask for Dr. Ahluwalia's opinion on a few issues that she touched upon in her address. Dr. Ahluwalia, you know, if we look at the title of your book, and which I found is actually fascinating, Postcards of Change, I think that's a most appropriate title, sort of aptly summing up the fact that it's an inspirational collection. And I also had the opportunity of going through some of these writings when they were coming up regularly as part of your column. One of the things that I was wondering was that very typically outside India, when people talk about the urban issues in India, the focus typically tends to be on the bigger cities, because that's where people normally travel to, maybe Mumbai, Chennai, Bangalore, Delhi as well. And the impression that people come back with is that there's an enormous amount of chaos, urban chaos and mismanagement. And you have actually documented this series of initiatives which are going on at the grassroots levels through which efforts are being made to change the current situation. If we look at it as a bottom-up approach, the point that you mentioned, that there's probably a Malkapur in Maharashtra, which has put in place an excellent system. There is Nagpur, which is attempting a unique PPP experience. Do you think it's going to be difficult for bigger Indian cities, let's say like Mumbai or Chennai, to reproduce these efforts in totality? Is it going to be much more challenging from them because of a complex political environment or other demographic factors that surround them? Sure.
You know, what you say is very true. The challenges of Mumbai and Chennai and Kolkata are much larger than those of smaller towns. One reason I have focused more on smaller towns is because I feel that unless we begin to fix the problems of the smaller towns, they will end up like our bigger cities. So this is, in a sense, this is an easier job. Also, politically, it's easier to get, a coalition of interests in smaller towns than in these bigger towns where there are vested interests. And thirdly, and but very important, I really believe in rural-urban synergy. And I believe that unless we get a planned strategy for urbanization, we cannot rejuvenate our rural sectors. And our politicians have fooled us for too long by talking of rural-urban divide. And I talk back to them and say that actually, far from being a rural-urban divide, the new technology, the new policies you can put in place, policies of logistics, of modern retail, which actually will connect the rural with urban in a way where the rural people will be able to diversify their crops. It also goes in the direction of sustainability. So I chose this space because that's where my commitment lay. Also, I feel that there'll be many saviors for the big cities. You know, they can get private financing, public-private partnership, and, you know, but if we don't get our act right at this level,
Right.
then that will be a much bigger mess.
Yeah, I think that's very well taken, that point. Dr. Ahluwalia, one particular initiative in India which actually is often talked about in Singapore in the various investor business communities that we come across is the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, about which there is an enormous amount of interest in Singapore. Singaporean companies are actually interested in playing a very active role in the urban and township development that's expected to take place around the TMIC. Now, I thought that one of the points that you made in your talk right at the beginning was actually very fascinating. You mentioned that growth accelerated in India, but the planners and the policymakers weren't probably prepared for the kind of urbanization impetus it would unleash. So to that extent, urbanization occurred in a rather unsynchronized, unplanned manner. Now, when an initiative like the DMIC comes up, do you think that the Indian planners and the authorities are actually prepared to guide urbanization in a sustainable fashion? Because this, I guess, is an issue which the investors looking at India for maybe township development and other opportunities would be very interesting and keen to look at.
In this case, actually, the government has set up a company which is engaging with 6 state governments. And I think Singapore is also involved in the design of 1 or 2 townships along the corridor. And we have a very dynamic officer, Amitabh Kundu, who is, I've seen his presentations and I've seen how much progress they've made in 1 or 2 cities. I think they're going about it very right. And this time, that is for the first time a little bit like how China prepares for its urbanization, for their urbanization. They've just announced yesterday that they are going to plan for 100 million people. So I think in this case, we are doing a little bit of that. And these are smart cities, modern cities.
Sure.
I think we are getting this one right.
Oh, that's really wonderful, and I in fact think that's a sentiment which we have. Dr. Ahluwalia actually vindicates this sentiment which has been expressed on a couple of occasions by senior Indian policymakers out here in Singapore, including the finance minister himself. And if, ma'am, now I can get the opportunity to come back to your visit to Singapore, and the time that you have spent here, the issues that have come across. You know, when we look back at certain aspects of Singapore's urban development, I mean, there are a few factors that we actually find very striking. One is how Singapore managed its water. Because at the time of Singapore becoming independent, Singapore actually didn't have access to water. There was a 99-year lease, Mr. Koo will correct me if I'm wrong, with Malaysia, on the basis of which water had to be delivered to Singapore. Then Singapore was vulnerable to floods, very heavy floods. And Singapore experiences an enormous amount of rainfall. And then over time, it became a very high-density city. So as a result of which, managing traffic and transport was a huge challenge. Now, these are, of course, by themselves features that we notice in certain parts of India as well, which have become urban challenges. I mean, what would be your take on how Singapore has actually handled this, and whether some of these can be reproduced in the Indian context? You mentioned about parcels of Indian states that can benefit from what Singapore has learned.
You know, I have no doubt that we have a great deal to learn from Singapore. But if you ask me what has been my additional perspective over and above what I already knew, I came here looking for what you've done in water, wastewater, transport, and the center has been really very, very good. must thank Mr. Koo for giving me a lot of that knowledge, understanding. I've had discussion sessions from which I've learned. But one thing that comes across is the, the power of soft governance. We actually end up, we always dismiss that by saying that Singapore believes in discipline and Indian democracy cannot be disciplined, but I don't think it is just that. I think it's a way of thinking. First, recognizing your vulnerability. You know, we are so vulnerable in so many ways, but if we don't understand it, we may look complacent. That does not make us any less vulnerable. So one is this appreciation of vulnerability on the part of every Singaporean. So I think it is really the job of people like us in India to really drive home the point to our fellow citizens who live in urban India that you are living in public health conditions which are disastrous for you and your children and your grandchildren. So it's not a talk of sustainability and any of that. It's just self-interest, you know. So you need to do all this. That's one powerful indoctrination that I found here is I think a very, very important resource that you have, and you take it for granted. You probably don't even know what difference it's making, and that's what we need to inculcate. You know, that's one. The second is this, what was it? You call it no wrong door, right? Or no wrong number, or whatever you call it. No wrong door. I mean, this is fantastic, and I am going to really publicize it in India because, you know, Indian government is full of you going to one part, whether you go through SMS or email or you present yourself at the desk, the other person has absolutely no hesitation in telling you this is not his job. You have to go to another building, maybe 2 kilometers away. And, you know, it's changing now. With e-governance, with protocol for how long it should take to redress grievances, with accountability being assigned to specific officers, it's changing. But I think if we could get to this stage where it's your job to tell me where, I mean, or to get someone to call me rather than me going to approach, I mean, I think that's fantastic. So what I have learned are these little things which cannot be learned from books or videos or even sitting on the internet and searching all the website of all your fantastic centers. So that has been, you know, my principal gain in this visit.
In fact, just to corroborate Dr. Ahluwalia's point on soft governance, when I came to Singapore 6 years ago, I knew that Singapore had very tough penalties on smoking. But then here, after coming here, I realized that the penalties are actually much more on littering. You know, throwing the cigarette butts everywhere on the roads rather than on smoking per se. And at that point in time, I also realized that how much of importance Singapore actually attaches to maintaining the sanctity of public space. So that was a real critical lesson to have learned. And I think there are more such little nuances that one picks up while being here. And what I'll do is that I cannot resist the temptation, knowing Dr. Ahluwalia's enormous expertise on fiscal issues and macroeconomics, to ask her one fundamental question on the sort of the ability of local governments in India to turn around this situation, because we know how difficult it has been for them despite fiscal devolution, that funds don't get passed on to them. They are cramped in their space for revenue mobilization, particularly extra budgetary resources. What do you see, ma'am, as the solution to this problem?
I thank you for giving me the opportunity to say something which I meant to in my lecture but just forgot. our committee has made a recommendation, and I keep repeating it all the time. What we are saying is that the center and the state governments are almost ready to come together. I think this will happen in the next 6 months to bring about a constitutional amendment whereby they can have a goods and services tax, which is uniform. And what we are saying is a small part of that GST should devolve to the third tier of government, and it should become automatic. And I think if that happens, you will create a base. Then another thing which I forgot to say is that not every city government has a municipal cadre. And if you talk of training and building capacity, you need to have somebody to train who will stay there in the cadre. So we've been asking for a municipal cadre from every state government so that you have a human resource base, and then capacity building. There, of course, the Government of India and state governments can actually do some hand-holding and bring in resource persons. But I think this GST sharing, fund devolution, is very, very important.
So will there be a fixed formula to that, ma'am? Or
Yeah, because when they do it, suppose they agree on an 8% GST, then there will be a certain proportion in which it will go, I don't know, for argument's sake, you can say 4-4.
Right.
So state governments get 4 and the center 4. And then we say, you give 0.25, the Government of India gives something states, so that they get 0.25% of the tax revenue from GST. And given the buoyancy of GST, that would be a very, very good base to start with.
Thank you so much. And now I think I don't want to deny this audience the pleasure of interacting with Dr. Ahluwalia. Please sort of raise your hand so that you are easily identifiable. Kindly identify yourself, your name and institutions. Anybody who might want to be the first? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Pragnya and I'm from a local architecture firm. My question is more about how you're able to, because policymaking in Singapore is actually very, not Singapore, India. I'm always curious about how you're able to, or the timeline involved in making policy, and there's this huge gap between, if I may, how civil servants are educated and where they come from versus ministers, and if they even are educated and where they come from and what they represent. And somehow between the two, you're supposed to not only make policy but implement it. I'm curious how you're able to do that and what the timeline is involved, where grassroots organizations come in, how think tanks actually contribute to that, as well as the role of education or universities in terms of research and their contribution.
Yeah, that in fact is a sort of fairly big canvas. Maybe what we will do is, ma'am, if you're comfortable, we'll collect 3 questions in one go and then slowly. Yeah, the second one, please. I'm not sure if I can see everybody in the back, but yeah, sure, Professor Menon.
I'm Gobinath Menon from the NTU. You talked about this idea of champions. Now, I've done some consultancy work overseas on transport, and I always find that if you have a champion, it moves, otherwise it does not move. And the champion is usually a political figure. Is that the same in India, or is it somebody else?
So I think you're referring to the human leadership
Yes.
point that Dr.
The champion
mentioned. Yeah, that's actually a very important issue. Okay, the last question for this first round, we are taking batches of 3. Yes, anyone? Please.
Hi, Anne Lockhoff. I'm busy studying how to integrate ITC into smart cities. It's more an extension of the question. just how startups can actually be used in the public-private partnership to actually create solutions for cities, and then the integration of ITC, given India's reputation for ITC professionals.
Thank you, ma'am.
First, Pranya, your question on, it's a very large question that you've asked. It's true that our policy makers at the administration level are from civil service background, certain educational, load that they carry with them. And the politicians are typically from grassroots. And now, of course, we have a new breed of politicians coming up. But your question is important because for a long time, the professionals had left politics to others. And as a result, we did develop a political class which may not have that sort of background that you have as administrators. But they are smart and they understand where votes come from. And what is very different today is that, and there's a certain lag. In fact, your question is very important because they believe that the votes are in rural areas. Actually, more and more Indians are moving to towns and cities. More and more voters are younger. And more voters are impatient. They are not going to take lame excuses. And more of them are connected with what's happening in the rest of the world. So and our media blows everything into, it's like a magnifying glass. You step the wrong way and they show you what you've done. So this particular election is happening in the context of all of this. So this will be a good test. I have no doubt that the politicians will then learn which way India is moving, and they will have to move with that. So I am, again, in the long haul, I think it's the least bad system of governance that we have, this democracy of ours. It does show all the blots, for everyone to see, but I'd much rather have it that way than live where I have to get a permit and move to a city and not know whether I'm a first-class citizen or a second-class citizen. So that would be the answer to your question. On the champion part, that this is so important, I can't tell you. And I find in my stories there are so many unsung heroes, who never got a Padma Award, who were never recognized at the national scene. In fact, on the occasion of releasing my book in Delhi, the finance minister, Mr. Chidambaram, pointed to one of my stories in Coimbatore, where I had even forgotten that I had said there that I had spent a full day with a deputy municipal commissioner who had spent 20 years in solid waste management. And how excited he was that finally, even in Delhi, they are getting interested in solid waste management, and how he had set up some processing facility and all, and his name was Shravana Kumar. So the finance minister said, those are the kinds of people who really end up making all the difference. So when we say a champion, it doesn't even have to be someone who's at a very senior level. It has to be someone who can then push the senior people because he believes in doing, what he can. And sometimes when you are a champion and you step on politicians' toes, you pay a price. I would be not speaking the whole truth if I didn't convey that. And I'm also aware of such instances. And now that, I have created this brotherhood, the community of all these municipal people with whom I am on SMS terms, and I call them up. So those stories also get back to me. But I think by and large, given that demand for good governance is rising, it's not going to be easy for politicians to play with champions when they actually want to deliver. That would be my answer to you. On ITC, one thing that I found in the application of IT in urban local governments was that it's become fashionable. So everybody wants to have computers in their offices, and they all want to show that, they are letting their people know that they can get their demands registered or pay their property taxes or through the net, or go to an internet cafe, or they can get their birth certificates, death certificates online. But what we found was that in many of these cases, the computer is just the front end where the complaint is registered. After that, it's all on foot. And nothing has changed. So one of the things that my stories highlight is that it's only when you integrate your software packages in different parts of the government to come together, only when you have re-engineered processes of functioning, can this IT work. And this is the other message that we now take to people. Otherwise, wherever you go, everyone wants to tell you that they are now using IT because they've bought a package, and they've installed that package. But that does not. So I think the emphasis on service delivery, what is the outcome, that keeps them under check. That have you actually lowered the time period between the registration of complaint and delivery? I think that's happening in only a few, whereas many more have gone through that process of, being there, doing that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahluwalia. So we will follow the pattern. We will take questions in 3. The next round, please. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Rakshada. I have a question. You said that media hasn't been able to capture the good projects, or the way media is it has blown up itself, and then the way it addresses this issue, it almost like directs the whole country's thinking that this is good and this is bad as per media what it thinks. So against that, in your understanding of Singapore, you also said that the main importance is the awareness, the self-awareness of it. So I want to know your point on how, if we have to go, maybe not against the media, but to encourage this public participation, or to tell people that there is something good happening in India also, and then we can be part of it. What is your take on that self-awareness within the countries?
May I just answer this
Sure.
question? Because, I always, actually as a matter of rule when I speak, I always encourage questions, because it's only through questions I find out sometimes that people have understood something very different from what I've said. It is not my case at all that media blows things out of proportion. What I was saying was that I think our media is a very positive factor, because if you take a wrong step, you can be sure today that the media will magnify it. What I meant by magnify is not add the wrong things to it, but they will show it to the world.
Yeah.
There are excesses in everything. There are excesses in government rule. There may be excesses in reporting. I'm not even touching that. My whole point is that media is a very positive development in our country. And therefore, if the media is highlighting what's wrong with us, don't get carried away, because, that actually helps us to set it right. How else will we set it right? And as far as projecting the positive side, I think again, when the government goes out to sort of, say we've done this, that, people normally discount that because it is the government's business to do the right thing. So they've done the right thing and people want to take it for granted. But what is happening now is that when there is misgovernance or when there is something which really needs to be set right, the government cannot just afford to wait because the media and the youth will ensure that there be a response. That was the point that I was making.
Thank you. So, yeah, the next, please. Yes. Go back to 3 questions.
Hello. Ma'am, good afternoon. I am Rajesh. I'm just wondering about the statement you made about you can't have even one single model town in India to present to the world. I'm just surprised that after 60 years we couldn't even get even one model town. What's your view on that actually? Why is it so?
Okay. Next one. Please.
Hi, Dr. Ahluwalia. My name is Dinesh from the Center for Livable Cities. Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. My question is, you've mentioned a lot about how Indian cities can learn from each other, as well as some things they might learn from Singapore. I'm wondering if you could mention maybe 1 or 2 things that cities outside India, whether Singapore or other cities, might be able to learn from innovations happening in India. For example, we read a lot about things like frugal innovation, e-governance, things like that. Maybe there's something you can highlight. Thank you.
Which is the first one you said? What innovation?
Some frugal innovation.
Frugal. Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
The last one for this round. I don't see any other hands, but ma'am, actually, just as a follow-up to the last question, in fact, I wanted to sort of ask your views on this earlier, but e-governance actually, as you have mentioned in your writings on a few occasions, I mean, e-governance has this tremendous potential to transform delivery and access of people to basic needs. And there are very interesting experiments that are taking place in India. But why do you think e-governance isn't becoming as pervasive as one would have expected it to become by this time? Because India, after all, now, I mean, we know that, I mean, technology and IT is almost in Indian blood, I mean, at this point in time. So what would be your reaction to that?
First, on you said that I can't show a single model town. First, let me say that the generic answer to that question would be when people ask me, which is the best state, which is the best city that you have found in the past 5 years. Now, I make a distinction between what are my considered reactions based on my research, and then what are my reactions as a general intelligent citizen of India. So on the first one, my answer would be that I was actually not looking for the best state or a best city. I went into a particular area to see, for example, I went to Navi Mumbai to see their wastewater treatment, because it happens to be one of the 3 cities in India which has 100% wastewater treatment. So Navi Mumbai may well have other things where it's doing very well, but I wasn't looking at that. And as I started my talk by saying, I'm not an urban person. So it's not even that I read about it in my textbooks and I was just reading. I looked at wastewater treatment and found them to be very, very good, and I reported that. So in that sense, when I had commented in my lecture, what I said was that I am not able to say, if there is one city which has, because I did not look for that. Having said that, my second level reaction as not a person who's worked on this, but is a general person, is that yes, perhaps it is true that we do not have a city that we can showcase to the world. I would say that one city that comes to mind when I talk about vulnerabilities and all, and mention was made of flood-prone nature of Singapore in earlier times and all, would be Surat. This is a city which, when I talk in India, and people understand that when I say, this city has visited hell and come back several times. Yeah. It's had floods, it has epidemics, it has had destruction, and this was a routine matter every 7-8 years because of its geographical location and not enough planning. This was happening. Since 2004, there have been really enormous efforts made to see that Surat has completely changed its Surat. Surat in Hindi means appearance. It's become resilient, but they are not stopping at that. They are one of the few cities in India that is actually developing a strategy on resilience, a longer term strategy. So, you know, something that in Singapore you hear, you find that Surat is going to that. Now, it's not accidental that Surat is a very rich city. You know, it exports, it's the largest exporter of diamonds from India. And so being rich helps to focus on, the future, your vulnerabilities, you have a lot at stake, so you better fix the physical surroundings around you. But that's not a good enough reason to say why other cities have not done that. Yes, I think part of the reason is that the political economy of India has been fixated on the rural. And there has been this misperception that the urban people are the haves and the rural people are the have-nots. And therefore, the whole urban area suffered from benign neglect. It was the main role of the state governments. They did not do their job. The center looked the other way, and the local governments were not even empowered until 1992. But it's now been more than 20 years where the constitution gave them the power, but even the constitution was silent on financing. What they said was each state will set up a state finance commission, and then that commission will provide the rules for devolution. Now, for name's sake, every state government set up a state finance commission. They had no intention of sharing or devolving power. So the mandate from the constitution to the city governments remained unfunded. I believe very strongly that we need a decentralized model. We need accountability closer to where action is. And for that, we really need to devolve funds and make city governments more powerful. But that's only a partial answer to our challenge of urbanization. At the same time, we need metropolitan planning, we need regional planning, we need rural-urban connectivity, because we are an economy undergoing significant structural transformation. So it's not just a question of giving each city the services that they need or planning for transit-oriented development within the city. It's much more than that. So we really need strategic intervention. And that's where the things like Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor and leadership from the center to partner with the state governments to set up new townships, invite private sector, because all this cannot be done by funding from the government. I think all that will become very necessary. Why is e-governance not as pervasive? You know, my feeling is that we are coming close to the tipping point when it comes to e-governance, because there was a phase where it was just fashionable to appear to be using IT, even if you don't improve service delivery. But now, in some cases, the link between e-governance and service delivery has really been shown, and there's pressure from other communities, other cities to say, why do we not get the same thing? And there is a lot of innovation by using startups. You know, in the southern states, in southern cities, for example, in Chennai, and actually this is in the whole state of Tamil Nadu, GIS is actually being used for road safety. You know, they've used GIS to track where there are accidents. Then they get the different departments, police, the engineering and other department to see, is this because there is something wrong with the road design? Or, you know, and then they try and improve. And I have a case study in the book which documents the real improvement in accidents in those sites. And I actually sent that particular column when it appeared to the man who's supposed to be the father of GIS in the United States. I had met him somewhere, so I sent this to him. And he wrote me back saying, you know, when we invented the GIS, we thought beyond defense, it will go to irrigation, even urban planning, but I never thought that GIS could be used as a safety belt. But there it is. So there are a lot of innovative applications. I haven't even talked of, you know, this new unique identity card that we are talking of, which then really enables you to have financial transfers, you know, which can be just done ensuring that it reaches the person and it minimizes leakages. You know, that's another area where IT has made a big, big difference.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I suspect we are gradually getting to our time, but we still have 5 minutes according to this clock at the back. So a couple of questions can probably be squeezed in if you keep them brief and to the point.
If I may say, I would really welcome even some comments.
Sure.
If someone from the audience feels that they were surprised by what I said, or that they are not convinced, because it helps me to learn better, you know, what it is that I'm
Yes.
trying to convey.
Absolutely, yeah. Mr. Koo, any points from your side, please?
Sorry, which one? Which question? Sorry, tell me again. I'm sorry if I did not. May I just ask?
That was the one on frugal innovation, I think.
Frugal innovation.
Yeah.
No, I think there is a lot of frugal innovation in India. In fact, you'd be surprised at there is this innovation of the candid camera, which is again in the book, which, you know, you basically give on the mobile phone, you give the camera to municipal supervisors who go and take pictures of community bins of waste. You must think I'm obsessed with waste, but if you work on urban areas, it happens to be so. And real time, it's downloaded onto a server where anyone can access it and see if the job has been done or not. And if it is not, then the municipal corporation imposes a penalty. Now, this was actually such a frugal innovation and did wonders to cleanliness of Hyderabad. I don't know if I said Hyderabad earlier, but apparently it was so successful that it had to succumb to the vested interests of the municipal workers, who again combined themselves and somehow convinced the authorities that this was redundant and that they could, so long as they did biometric attendance, the authorities would be satisfied that they did the job. Now, my response to the municipal commissioner was, but biometric attendance only ensures the input that the fellow came, but it doesn't ensure the output that the bin was cleaned. So how come that you gave in? But apparently for the time being, they've given in. But so 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. That's democracy. It's also foxtrot.
Any last final comments? Any views, thoughts?
Mr. Lowe, you cannot get away. I am very keen to hear if after hearing me, if there are some thoughts that come to your mind on whether you think we can fix it and how we can.
I thought I have an easier task today, being the audience, especially. I was trying to sit far away from Mr. Koo, actually. There is hope, certainly hope. If you look at Indian cities, and you compare them with Singapore. Singapore in the 60s, even in the 70s, I don't think we were too far from what some Indian cities are, the conditions are today. Singapore was and still is very lucky. I mentioned to you yesterday, at the top of it, the politician, the political vision, the vision, it must start with a vision, and there must be a determination, political will to do so. Now, if you do not have that politician and don't have the will, then it's very difficult to work your way down. And like Menon have said, champion is very important. Now, you need to have many champions, but you need a very, very big champion up there to drive the entire country, an entire city forward. I don't know India as well as some of you here, especially you, but I do know Bangalore because I visited Bangalore several times for project. From what I see of Bangalore, it is moving ahead. What I think is that the opportunities are there. Question here is, how do you create that opportunity that is conducive for not just the government participation, the people, community, and the private sector. Private sector, not just in Indian private sector, but foreign private sector come in. The fact that you are here today, the fact that you are championing the entire urbanization, infrastructure, and so on, my personal feeling is that the tremendous hope for India, and there's great opportunities for India. Also, the great opportunity for Singaporean companies to participate in your development, in your advancement. Thank you.
Any response? Thank you. So, thank you so much. On that note, I think we come to a close, and for me, again, personally, a great delight, ma'am, to have the opportunity of getting engaged in this discussion. Once again, I end up on the beneficiary side. I have learned so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amithendu.
Most
Thank you.
welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ishar, and thank you, Dr. Palit, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. We would now like to invite Mr. Koo, the Executive Director of the Centre for Livable Cities, to join the panel on stage for photo taking. Mr. Koo, please. Thank you. And with that, we mark the launch of Dr. Ishar's new book, Transforming Our Cities. The book can be purchased at the booth outside the auditorium. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the book launch as well as talk. We thank you for your participation and do join us as we feature Jan Gell next week at the NTUC auditorium. Do stay tuned to the Centre for Livable City mailers and website for more details. We will also be seeking your feedback via email and would greatly appreciate it if you could take a minute to help us improve the lecture series. Have a good evening and we hope to see you again. Thank you.